questions area, and then I can keep an eye on it. And as they can, I'll be happy to answer them. One little thing though, with respect to questions, try and keep the questions relevant to the topic at hand. And if it's not, then I'll happily still answer them, but I will wait until the end of the class if it's not related to the subject matter. Okay. All right. If you can hear me, then maybe just type something into the question box so that I know that you can hear me. And then obviously I'm not talking to myself for the whole hour. You're wondering what's going on. So if you could do that, that'd be great. And then we'll get started. Thank you, Tara. That's great. Okay. All right. Let's carry on. My name is Miles Gibson, IronSpeed MVP. And I'm happy to be able to teach this class again, obviously using IronSpeed 12.1. All right, let's carry on. As mentioned, hopefully you're using either your speakers or using one of the telephone lines through GoToWebinar. I hope that's great. I hope that's working out. As I said, ask questions at any time. We don't have a moderator today, but I will endeavor to read the question out and obviously, provide an answer as I can. Whoops. Okay. Today, extending the data access layer. So we'll talk about that. We've got a number of slides to go through. The session today is about an hour, but I'm happy to let it run over a little bit for any extra Q&A that's there. Okay. All right. Where to start? The first thing you need to know, if you aren't aware of it, is every web application is based upon an architecture model called an N-tier application. Fundamentally, that really means 3 layers. There's the bottom layer, which is the data access layer. That's obviously what we use to communicate with to the database servers itself. Business layer, which speaks to both the UI layer and the access layer, and of course then the interface or the UI layer, which can talk to the business layer. And all of that works pretty well for most web applications. Okay. Today we're obviously going to talk about the bottom layer, which is the data access layer, and it's pretty interesting what you can do with that. Best practices, of course, is that anytime you make changes to the UI layout area, it shouldn't impact anything in the code behind. And the second item that says changes to the database should have minimal impact on the UI layer. That's fundamentally correct. In other words, I should be able to apply some validations and things like that, setting variables and so on and so forth at the database schema level without having it dramatically affect UI layer. Now, of course, if I have I don't care, let's say an add record page, for example, that I've created in IronSpeed, and at the time I create the page, there's a field called notes, then all is well. If I go back to the database and change that notes field, in other words, maybe I rename it or I take it right out of the schema, then obviously that's going to be a problem in the UI layer. So, but fundamentally, architecture-wise, we don't want to have them too tightly coupled. Data access layer must use strongly typed objects, so that means that everything has to be declared. What does that mean, you ask? It means that variables need, every variable has a type, and so all of our variables also have to be typed. So we have to declare them as string, as integer, as decimal, and so on and so forth. So keep that in mind. And of course, IronSpeed takes care of all of that for us, except where we do custom code. Okay. Paging must be done in the database, not in memory. Well, in a perfect world, yes, that's absolutely true. However, you will find when you start using third-party controls, there are a lot of the grid controls, whether it's the standard ASP ones or you're talking about DevExpress or Telera, they're always talking about how great their tools are, and that's because they end up caching some of your data in memory. Of course, it's happening all in behind the scenes. You never see it, so you think it's really cool and good, but fundamentally, it still comes down to how much memory does your server have and how fast is it. Concurrency handling is important in highly asynchronous applications. What does that mean? It means that we're talking about multi-user and being able to manage the requests from multiple users all at the same time, fundamentally. So that it's a multi-link highway, if you will. Okay, that's what that is. All right, carrying along. All right, IronSpeed offers 2 primary ways to work with the data access layer. Something called the batch wizard, or in previous versions called the batch meister wizard. In fact, I was just updating this slide and I didn't change BMW, so it doesn't refer to a car. It refers to the batch wizard. Whoops. Oh, I'm sorry. Touchy today. And that's where we can apply global formulas across the entire application. That's pretty cool because it's perfect for auditing, among other things. And we'll see some examples of using the batch wizard here shortly. So that's terrific. And then in the databases area, you can apply formulas at the business and the data access layer, of course, and change properties and validation in the databases area. So if you aren't aware of it, go to the databases area, and there's a lot of different things that you can do there. A good primary example of what you can do in the databases area is setting the default value for a label. So using my example for the notes field, instead of, let's say I've got that notes field in a customer record, and that's in 50 pages in throughout my IronSpeed application, I don't have to go to 50 spots to change the label, to change it from, let's say, notes to internal notes. In fact, I can go into the databases area and I can find the customers table, locate the notes field, and then set the default label for that field and do it once. And of course, I can do this at any time. I have to have the pages created, or if the pages are already created, it doesn't matter. IronSpeed will take care of it and deal with that for me. So that is super powerful and really does make a difference. Okay. And of course, the whole idea of doing it through the interface is that means you have less to worry about with respect to understanding or knowing or working with ASPX, HTML markup, or any sort of coding, C# or VB, for example. Not to say that you can't do that. You certainly can, but in fact, you don't have to. And that's the whole, one of the purposes of IronSpeed is, in terms of code generation, is to do all the heavy lifting or all the hard work for us. So, okay. The formula language was introduced a few versions ago so that you don't have to learn how to be a developer. In other words, you don't need to know VB or C#. Formula language is very much along those same lines as what you would see in Microsoft Excel. And there's a lot of common stuff that you can do, 75 to 80% or so, using formulas. Pretty easy to extend. You can even put in your own functions and have them available through formula, which is pretty cool. I haven't done a lot with that, but I certainly do see the power of it. And anyway, the reason I don't do that is because I'm a pretty strong developer, so more often than not, I just have a tendency to just jump in and write the code and take care of it. But if you had a team environment and maybe had one or two strong developers and your other IronSpeed users were not, you have those developers build those local and global extensions for you, and then you just basically call them without having to worry about any of the underlying complexity. And of course, you can extend independently for either the presentation layer and or the data access layer. Okay, no code customizations now for Audit Trail, because of course we can do that in the batch wizard. Same with data access level validation. Global display foreign key. That's where you would see that as in a drop down. As an example, any sort of list that you have, that's sort of what DFKA stands for, display foreign key as. And so in a relational database where you have, for example, orders, and those orders belong to a customer, and each order has a salesperson or an employee that manages that order, you can decide how you want that user / employee to be presented within the orders table. And so, again, depending on what you want, you could have, in this example, we've got first name space last name. Could be last name plus comma plus first name, etc., that sort of thing. Default values, great for default values. Setting those where maybe order date equals today. You could even do ship date as today plus 10 days. All kinds of great things that you can do, so it works out great. As mentioned, the label text. In this here, they're using resource text amount, so that refers to localization. So if your application needs multiple languages, then that's where that will happen, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later towards near the end of it. end of the presentation about how you can really supercharge your application to be completely multilingual. Encryption, decryption. So that's a perfect example. Obviously, in today's world, we're hearing all the time about, this large department chain or that bank or, some organization is getting hacked, and hackers are getting databases of information, including credit card numbers and so on and so forth. So good practice, best practices suggest that using encryption, decryption for sensitive information, which unfortunately probably almost amounts to anything anymore, we can make that process now very transparent using default encryption, decryption formulas that are available, so that the data gets encrypted when it gets saved to the database, and then gets decrypted when it gets pulled from the database and presented on the screen. So that is, is very powerful and should be, part of your best practices everyday thing that you're going to do. Okay. The batch wizard, global initialization, implemented audit trail, and more. By default, almost every table that I build has 4 fields: created on, created by, updated on, updated by. And that's a very simple level of auditing. You could certainly get much more complex than that, and maybe if I've got some time, I'll talk about that. But fundamentally, those basic 4 fields can become very relevant. The created on is essentially a timestamp when the record was created, on the date and more specifically the time. The created by and the updated by are only, in most cases, going to get populated if you have security enabled. And again, a lot of the time you do have that. So if you don't care who updated it, then those 2 fields don't matter. And of course, then the updated on tells you when the record was last updated, and that can have some very important considerations. I've extended the auditing considerably with some custom code to the point where the entire record gets saved into an HTML table, which gets pushed into another database table, and then the user can see the list of which fields were updated and which weren't. So that's very powerful, and just kind of shows you what you can do with IronSpeed. So, and as you can see, you've got audit trail and others. You've got encrypt, decrypt, which is fantastic, and validate. You could make sure that every date, if you're going to enter a birth date, it can't be anything other than today or before, as an example. Where clause, where you can filter by login user, session variable, URL parameter. These are all valid, and I use all 3 of these all the time. Some different button actions and so on. And these are things that, remember, these are global actions that you're using, which is great. One of the things that is available in IronSpeed is the quick selector, which is the successor to what was formerly called the large list selector from a few versions ago. And the whole idea of that is using the quick selector to manage large lists of data. And I think by and large it works pretty well. However, if you went ahead and created a bunch of pages and then realized that a number of your drop-downs were set as quick selectors instead of just regular drop-down lists, and they don't need to be because you maybe only have 4 or 5 items in your drop-down list, then you can go in and you can have IronSpeed switch all those over from quick selectors to drop-down lists, or vice versa, as the example is, right? So that's another thing they've done. This is the new latest incarnation of the batch wizard, and I can see slowly over time they really are starting to improve it in terms of what you can do, so that part's great. Okay, so again, using this as an example, how you can use this formula function to encrypt the credit card number and or decrypt it, so that's great. We talked about that before, so that's terrific how that can work. Validation, as I say, as I just mentioned, you can make sure that the birth date's always greater than today. If not, produce this error message. So that part's great. Whoops. And they're all really easy to use. There's pretty straightforward. Actually, there's a formulas class. I forget. I think it's at the 201. I'm guessing 201 or 301 is the formulas class, and that's a great class to take. I love teaching it. I learned a few things myself first time I taught it, so that was great. So that part's good. Global where clause, multi-tenant applications, and more. So what's nice here is if you have a database and you want to filter, let's say you want to filter an entire application by client ID. So in other words, every table is always filtered by client ID. And that's perfect for what's called a multi-tenant application, and that is where you have separate clients using your application, and that's sort of the the wonderful place that you want to get to. If you're building that cool application and you want it's the next Facebook or whatever, you want to put that up on the web, and it's much easier to manage things in a lot of cases with one database than having multiple databases. In other words, what a lot of people do is they'll have one database and one application, or multiple databases, pardon me, and one application where each database is for each client. Well, that works great until you need to update the databases, and then of course you have to go and update the application. So at the end of the day, if you can have one application and one database, you're probably better off. Okay, and so being able to do these global filtering is terrific, and so there's a lot of options there. Or it may just be the case where you've got an internal support application, say an order entry system, and you just know that when your salespeople log in, they only see their orders, for example, and that's again ridiculously simple thing to go ahead and do. And so of course iron speed, you can again set these things globally. One of the improvements I'm hoping that they'll consider to do with the batch wizard is to actually let me select which tables I want to apply the batch wizard constructs to. At the moment, it's sort of an all or nothing thing. So that's a little bit of an issue, but otherwise, I think it offers a lot of value. Okay, 2 types of data sources. I'm not seeing any questions yet, by the way. So if you have any questions, by all means, please let me know. Fundamentally, 2 types of data sources. I'm sure you're all familiar with what a data source is now. It's basically where the data comes from, obviously. And so 2 types of data sources. One is the generic data source used by aggregate functions, which you see in charting and that sort of thing, sums and counts. And of course, table specific, used by only table or record panels. And so where I want to retrieve a specific list of records or a specific record itself, and that would be a table specific, so it's not an aggregation. Only table specific data source can be easily customized in record and table classes, and that's just because things get more complex when you have to start doing group bys at the SQL level. That being said, my preferred way of doing it is if I need a group by and I need some counts or whatever, I will go and build a view in my database SQL Server, and then work with that view. Which, in other words, then I'm offloading most of the heavy lifting to the database server. But that's just the approach that I use. Okay, I have a question from Benson. At one point, does the resource function come readily? You could use the resource function anytime you want. What you will need to do, however, is, and then I'll explain this a little bit later, a little more later, Benson, is you will need to populate the resource files manually yourself, and that's of course where my milestone localizer tool comes in and does all of the hard work for you. Okay. Okay. Carrying right along. Customize table-specific data source. You can certainly do programmatic access and filtering, only if the formulas are not sufficient. Yeah, that becomes a sort of a personal preference, I think. It's nice. It's very, very nice to have both. I use formulas for the really simple stuff, defaults and that sort of thing, and then for things like validation and that sort of stuff. Because I'm very familiar and very comfortable working in code, I will often jump in and put my validations in code. Again, unless it's a very simple one, Of course, the advantage to using the batch wizard is that I can apply global validation across a wide range of tables and views, which is great. Strongly typed, of course. In other words, every variable, every value needs to be associated with a type, so that part's important. Object for record corresponds to a row. Object for a table is used for querying the data, and displaying the data, of course. You don't need to know really much about SQL. IronSpeed has tweaked the interface very nicely, so that as long as you understand a little bit of logic, that's great. So that part's good, and of course, all the table-specific data sources support paging and sorting, so that you can pull out certain pages, certain range of pages, and sort by, I think it's 4 or 5 different criteria. Okay. Use data access layer a goal. How to programmatically retrieve records from the database. Again, paging, update records, use and/or clauses, and order by, of course, and even delete records. And I just recently did that for a nonprofit application for my local triathlon club, and I was amazed at how quickly I was able to write a few lines of code and be able to delete a master record with a half a dozen detail tables on it. And of course, if you may or may not have ever heard of something called referential integrity. That's a database term, and what that refers to is if I've got an order and a bunch of order details in it, I don't want to accidentally delete the order and lose, all of the order details that go with it. So the default rule is that I can only delete the order if there's no child records, no detail records with it. So I would have to go in and delete all of the detail records first, then go and delete the order master record, if you will. And so that's by design, and it's actually very good. But of course, it does become problematic if you do ever need to delete the record. And so that's where being able to programmatically deal with that makes a big difference. Benson has another question. He says he doesn't really understand what strongly typed is. You can, when you are programming, Benson, you can declare a variable. A variable is just a holding place, if you will, to store information. I could declare any variable as of a type object. Okay, and an object is just again, it's another imaginary construct, if you will. But that doesn't necessarily help me if I want to display that as currency, or if I want to display that as a date, for example. It's just a type object. Then .NET doesn't know what to do with it. It doesn't know how to deal with it. I can't apply any special functions to it. So however, if I strongly type a variable as a date, as a string, as a Boolean, then I can do things with it. I can check and see what the value is. As a date, I could add days or minutes or hours or weeks to it, for example. If it's an integer, I can add or subtract other integer values, so on and so forth. So that's where the strongly typed comes from, and there's a whole big bad world out there in terms of software development, and it is a lot of work to get there. It's well worth it once you get there, because it makes you a lot more independent and a lot more flexible in terms of what you can do. I mean, IronSpeed is an amazingly awesome product, but you still always are going to have this requirement to be able to extend what's going on. So then you asked, Benson, can it mean the character type of the field? Yeah, fundamentally, that's what it means. Fundamentally, that's what we're talking about for any bound fields. In other words, any fields that are directly connected to a field in a database. That's correct. Okay, so IronSpeed, when it generates code for us, and that's what we call Section 2 code, and we never change Section 2, but it's a great place to go in and have a look and see what's what. What they do is they generate the classes according to the name of the table. So, as shown here in the example, if I want to work with a single record from my customers table, I'm I know that that class that IronSpee generated for me is called customers record. It's from the products table, products record, employees table, employees record. Okay, and these are constructs, if you will, strongly typed again, so they're quite rigid, which is good because there's less chance of errors then. So your application is just that much more robust and safe. And this is referred to as a record class. Okay, and so you need to understand that when you define a class, you're defining a template, if you will. You're defining how you're going to be able to use the data when you grab the data. You can think of a class as it is very much an object, because we live in an object-oriented world. In other words, all our software development is object-oriented, so we model, we model everything according to an object that's in the real world. I may have a class called vehicle. And within vehicle, I may have a manufacturer, I may have a make, I may have a model, I may have, and so on and so forth. And I'm going to really describe, I want to be able to describe that vehicle in a generic way. And so that's what we do when we define our record and table classes, as an example. And of course, the same thing, as I said, in terms of the naming, it's the table name followed by the word table. The view name followed by the word view. Or query, which you don't see as much anymore. But and that's the way IronSpee is going to name everything. You'll note that when you look at an IronSpee application, for example, if you go and look at the folder, I'm going to bring up one here. Hopefully, I can do it at the same time as I'm talking. It most typically organizes things by. Pull this over now. You can see here it's by the various, so for example, in here I've got members, okay, and so on and so forth. So in a second here I'll go and actually show you some of the code that it works, that gets generated as a result of this, but just bear with me for a minute here. Schema for the database table, including column type, formatting, etc. And that's exactly right. We want to model, we want to be able to use data from our database in a certain way. Relational databases, which is mostly what we're still all working with, consist of a filing cabinet called a table, let's say a customer's table, and within that customer's table filing cabinet we have file folders, and within each file folder is information about each customer. And so it's okay to think about a database that way as well. It's a very efficient and very, very well organized filing cabinet. Okay, and so when we talk about the schema, we're talking about the fact that every customer will have the same type of pages in their filing within their folder within that filing cabinet. Okay, or within that filing cabinet drawer. Maybe you may say that your filing cabinet drawer would be each table. Okay, and then of course IronSpee also generates all of the back-end code for retrieving a record, saving a record, or as mentioned before, in terms of deleting a record. Okay, if you're not a developer, a certain amount of this is going to be pretty much Greek to you. Try and just sort of hang in there and stay with it if you can. It is complex to begin with, but I'll tell you what, using the IronSpee, what I call the IronSpee object model, that's what this is vastly, vastly, vastly easier than having to write it yourself using just native .NET code. Absolutely, so much faster. I don't even want to think about doing it any other way. Okay. So, for example, if we were looking at the employee record, the first name is most likely going to be a string value, which a char, a varchar in the database, that sort of thing. Hire date would be a date field, or maybe even a date. Yeah, probably not a time field, but a date field. Whoops. Order amount, currency, of course, because it relates to money. Quantity is numeric of some kind. Normally, quantity would be an integer, but of course, that really depends on the application. If you're selling spices, then you might sell 12.5 grams of turmeric. Um, but if you're talking about an inventory system, or you're selling bicycles, then your quantity is always going to be in whole numbers. So you have to think about your field types as you are, as you're designing your database. And I haven't mentioned this yet, although I'm always trying to just really, I can't stress enough that your database design is about the most important thing that you can get right for an IronSpee application. Get your database design done right, and IronSpee will take care of so much for you. Okay. Common methods that IronSpee generates for us, again, based upon what it's learned when it does the scan of the database itself through the schema sync. Save function, delete function, the get ID function, so it goes out and as a key value pair, it goes out and gets the primary key, whether again it's a single integer primary key or a composite key. I work very hard at trying to always use a single integer primary key. It just makes it that much easier. Whoops. I don't know why I'm having a problem here today. There we go. Get ID, which will go out and actually get that ID value. And then there's additional functions, parse and format. So you can go from different values, different value types. Okay, and of course the ubiquitous format command, which will allow you to take. And this is where understanding that if you have a date format and it's stored as mm/dd/yy, but you need to, and let's say that's the way it's stored in the database, and if it's a Microsoft SQL Server, then it's stored in that format in the database. You need to be able to display it in a different format. Maybe you want to display it as year, month, day, or day, month, year, if you're from Canada or the UK as an example. Then you've got a different date format, for example, or maybe you want to display your numeric value in a particular way. So keep that in mind, when you're starting to think about using these. Okay. Shared properties. Well, of course, when you're looking at a table class, it has a list of all the column names. Some of the common methods that every table class has is GetRecord to go out and get a single record, GetRecords to return an array of records of the type of the record class. Okay, so if you have a customers table and you go out and get a record or get records, it's going to return either one record or an array of records of customer record class. Okay, so it just obviously makes sense to put apples with apples. And same with delete record and delete records, get count, get columns. If you want to start getting into metadata, you'd use get columns as an example. Okay. So records are returned as objects. Of course, as we talked about, as I just mentioned, if you're going to do a get record, let's say a customer table dot get record call, it's going to return an object. If found, it's going to return an object of customer record type. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure about your question, Octavio. I have to leave that for a minute, and I will try and talk about that in a little bit. Okay. All right. And same with your question, Benson. I'm going to have to leave that just for the moment till we get through some of this other stuff, and then I'll come back and we'll talk about it. Okay. Sports paging. Okay, so records returns objects. Yes, we've seen that. Not an array of fields. That's correct. As just mentioned, through either a get record or get records. Each field is of its own native type. So if you have a bar char field type in the database, it'll get returned as a string, which is the native type for bar char in the database. It's just a string value in .NET within IronSpee. You can, when you use get record or get records as an example, you can have it return specific pages of records. So you don't have to go and get all the records at once. That can be very, very important if you've got a database with, where you've got a record, you got to process, 100,000 records. You don't want to go out and try and retrieve all 100,000 records at once. You'd want to pull them in at 100 at a time or 1,000 at a time or something along that line. And so that's what that allows. Supports foreign key expansion. Okay, so basically what happens is that when you use the Iron Speed object model, I can do a where string where employee ID equals name, but actually you can see they're using no hidden, enclosed in quotes. So that tells me that it's a string. So actually what happens is Iron Speed parses that and figures out that it actually should be employee name or employee last name. It all depends on what the construct is in the data access layer for the display foreign key as. So that's actually pretty powerful that you can do that. I don't know necessarily that I would want to do that, but you can certainly do that, and you may need to do that based upon if it's a certain construct of a view and you don't have access to the employee name directly, then you could still do your where clause like this. So I guess there is some value to that. And supports order by. So obviously, when you do your get records call, you can actually go in and create multiple order by scenarios. And I've got a great example of that, which works great. And hopefully, I'll get time to be able to show that to you. Okay. One of the other nice things about the Iron Speed object model is it opens and closes the database connections automatically. Automatic caching of data. At the level at which we're using the Iron Speed object model, in other words, customers table.getRecords, as an example, I don't need to know whether I'm actually using inline SQL method or using stored procedures. Stored procedures are all defined at a much lower level. Okay, so I don't have to worry about that at all. That just gets taken care of, seamlessly for me. And of course, I don't really need to know SQL. I need to know a little bit. I need to know, that employee ID equals. Like I need to know that construct, but I don't have to have an in-depth knowledge of SQL in order to be able to make a database call. Okay. All right. So if you're going to do this in SQL, if you're going to jump into SQL Server, you could type this construct where saying go out and get all fields from the customers table where the country equals USA. So country is obviously a string value of some kind. And I want to order it by state ascending, which is going to return 10 records from page 17. Well, you wouldn't care about that at that point, I don't think. If you're using the data access layer, the customers table, using the construct that's already built for you, all you're really doing is applying the where string and an order by. Okay, and you can see down here, customers table.getRecords, where you're passing in the where string that you've defined as a variable, passing in an order by object, which you've created. This is a very simplistic example, doesn't show you everything. And then returning 16 records from page 10, I think. Yeah. And then they're returned as an array of customer record objects. So just as I talked about. Okay. And I know that still may be a little fuzzy in terms of how this actually works. You need to go in to section 2 and start looking at how Iron Speed uses its own object model to make your application work. So you can see, go in and open up Visual Studio if you've got it. If you don't, download the Express Edition. Open up your application, and then you know what? Go in and just do a find on GetRecords, and you can start to see all the different places that Iron Speed uses these, and you can start to drill down and see the different function calls and see how it works. It's an absolutely terrific way to get to know the Iron Speed object model. Okay. One of the things that you do always have to do, and this is part of the whole idea of building a multi-user application, is you have to start a transaction and you have to end a transaction. Depending on what you're doing, you can get away without starting it. For example, in a save button operation, it's already got a transaction boundary built in, so you can often get away with doing a get, a delete, or a save within that. Within the, let's say, the button click handler event for the save button, which is the save button click event. and so you can get away with that. But otherwise, if you were in the commit transaction event for the page, after the application record has been committed, and then if you've got some additional processing you want to do, you'd have to add in your own transactions. I, for the most part, try and always use transactions. Sometimes I get busy, I get a little rushed, and then I don't put it in. But you know what? When you do that and it needs one, your application is going to blow up. You're going to get an error telling you that there's no transaction, in which case then you would have to go back, and do it. The commit transaction is only required if you're saving or updating. So saving or deleting, right? So an add record, edit record, saving or deleting, / updating. Okay, and of course, using a try-catch block is always great for handling any sort of exceptions that can happen. You can always have exceptions from the database for all kinds of reasons. Okay, so you've got to keep that in mind, right? And here is a perfectly good example where I have this one's in Visual Basic, where I have a try-catch block. First thing I do inside my try is I start the transaction using dbutils. dbutils is part of the base classes. So base classes .utils.dbutils, I believe, is the syntax for that. You can see that I'm going to dimension or declare a variable called rec or rec of type customers record. So again, this is strongly typed instead of just saying dim rec as object. And then rec equals new customers record. So I want to create a new instance of that customers record construct, that customers record template, if you will. And I'm going to then assign the company name in this record to equal Iron Speed Inc. Okay, and then I'm going to save. Now, this simplistic example obviously presumes that there's no other required fields for the company table, for the customers table, and so on, right? And then, of course, because I'm changing data to the table. At this point, I haven't committed this record to the database yet, so it's still sitting in memory. That's where I have to commit the transaction. Okay. Also note that in most cases, if you have, let's say, you have a single integer primary key for the customers table, typically called customer ID, that new value is not going to become available until you commit the transaction, because then that data gets flushed out to the database server grabs it, stores it in the database however it wants, and then at that same time it assigns the new key value. Okay. If there's an error, it gets handled in the exception, in which case then we roll back the transaction, and if required, then we throw an exception to stop processing. Okay. And then finally, regardless of what happened up here or even here, we have to end the transaction. Otherwise, you end up with all of these open transactions, and that can radically affect performance if enough of them get stocked up into memory. So you need to try and make sure you do your cleanup, okay, in that regard. Okay. Done that one. There's a variety of variances for your GetRecord call. But you really need to just use the one that works for you for most of it. Okay. If you go and do a GetRecord call and it doesn't find it, in VB it's going to return a value of nothing, which is essentially the same as null in C#. Or if it finds it, it will then return a record object for that type. So if I'm using customers table .getRecord, and I pass in, whatever the value is, whether it's a key value or it's a string. If you go out and get record where customer ID equals 1 as an example, if it finds it, it's going to return an object of customers record. In fact, if I go back here, if I wanted to do a get record, I'm sure they've got an example here. I still have to define rec as customers record, and then rec equals customers table.getRecord. And I'm sure they'll show that here in a minute here, but that's and if for some reason when you're only using get record and not get records, then if multiple matches occur, it'll return the first record. Okay, which may or may not be what you want. So, this get record call here, I've always had a love-hate relationship with. Theoretically doing a get record, passing in an ID value or a where string, comma, a true or false value in terms of whether you want the record to be mutable. In other words, do you want the record to be that's returned to be read-only, or do you want to be able to update it? Okay, and so what the slide says is that's the only way to get an updatable record. It's not entirely true. There is another way to do it, but which I actually use that this doesn't. But theoretically, this is supposed to always work. I still seem to have issues with it. I don't know why. So I have a different method. You can contact me online later, offline later, and I'll be happy to send it to you. But I didn't get time to update this slide with my other value in it, so I apologize for that. Again, two variations for doing this. And so you can see here where if you defined update rec or rec equals customer table get record, and then pass in another value. So there's lots of different ways that you can do it in terms of passing in a composite key value, etc. Here, for example, you can see where you've got employee ID equals 37. That's presuming 37 is a varchar or a string value. I actually think that maybe that might be a typo. I'll have to check that. You probably shouldn't have quotes around the 37. I suspect that employee ID is actually an integer value. So I'll have to check the slide on that one. Customer ID, and then I think this is the Northwind or the Southwind database. That's correct. Customer ID is actually a char value. Whoops, I'll have to check on the employee one. And you can even add in a construct where customer ID is like AL%, and you can even get a little funkier with this. But of course, anytime you're using a like statement, it would be I would be concerned that I'm retrieving the right record. The like statements usually return multiple records. And so I'd be concerned that I would be getting the one single record that I wanted, but I guess it depends on the construct, depends on what you're doing. Okay. Okay, so Terrace has a good question. If you were to set up a start page in a user table, then when the user logs in, you could use the GetRecord call to return the initial display page to use rather than hard-coded start pages done in the code customization wizard. Yeah, sure, you could. In fact, Terrace, that's exactly what a lot of people do. Is you modify the user table to have a start page, and when the user logs in, you would then have their ID value, or at least their username, to be able to use. Although IronSpeed, if you logged in successfully, IronSpeed will return the user ID to you. You would then, it's exactly right. You use a GetRecord call to grab the user record, find the start page, and then redirect to the start page, and that's exactly what people do. And the beautiful thing about that, of course, is that it then allows you to tailor what start page, what the start page is on a per user basis, which in some cases is very important. Depending on how you construct things. So yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, it really is. Okay, carry on. Okay, so then the get records is again the same whole idea, where you're passing in a where clause of some kind, possibly an order by, depending on how you want the data ordered, so on and so forth. I wonder if I've got. No, I'm going to just open up. I'm going to open up Visual Studio. Oh shoot. Okay. Close that out. I'm trying to install Visual Studio 2015 today. I had some issues with it, so let's see if that'll load now. Okay. So while that's doing that, I'll carry on. Oops. Sorry about that. That's not what we wanted. There we go. I'm really messing with that. Apologies. There we go. Okay. 10 variations. So again, it's all about doing a call to return multiple records. And you want to then process those records. Again, the same kind of construct: where string, order by, page index, page size, and so you can determine how many records you want to return in terms of your pages, and then process until there's no more data, essentially. And so you can see you've got all these different variations, and play around with it to your heart's content. You can also do create a filter object, a base filter object, or SQL filter object, and do some funky stuff, which is really great if you want to do things like subselects, subselects, and other kind of really cool stuff like that. You can do that via still do it via the GetRecords. Requires a little bit more work to create the base filter object and all that kind of stuff. So, but it is absolutely doable. Okay. Okay. And GetRecords takes anywhere string, yeah, pretty much. Returns a list of non-updatable records, that's correct. But then, of course, within that, so you can see here's a nice little construct here where within my records is customer record. And you notice they're adding the 2 parentheses here, which means it's going to return an array. And then my records equals customers table got records where country equals USA. So in other words, return on. That requires a typo there because that USA should be surrounded by quotes, single quotes. So I'll have to deal with that in the slides. If my records equals nothing, then I don't have anything to process. So what we're saying here is if not is nothing, my records, in other words, my records equal something, then go ahead and process, right? And for each record, my records, in this case, they're just pulling out the company name. I could, at this point, make each one of these records mutable or writable, and I could certainly do that if I wanted to, and then maybe update stuff. So it could be that I got some specific processing that I want to do, or maybe I want to do something like send an email out to everybody who's in the United States. Every customer who's in the United States, I want to send them an email about X, Y, or Z. Or if it's Canada, it's X, Y, Z. So there's that consideration. So it's a lot of flexibility, a lot of things you can do with it. Okay. Again, get records, anywhere string, any order by. Page index starts with 0. You can determine what your page size is, right, and then sort of carry on from there. So again, depending on how many records you have to deal with, you can deal with them in bite-sized amounts, if you will. Okay. So it's otherwise pretty much the same thing. GetRecord takes a where clause. I don't know why that's the same thing. That's almost a redundant slide. Retrieve only certain columns with GetRecords. Public overridable function. I haven't done a whole lot with this. This is kind of a new slide. In this case, you're creating a new column. Oh, I see. Just using a column list. I suppose if you have a situation where you have a table with 1,000 columns in it, let's say, and there are databases out there with 1,000 columns. Usually they're big, ugly, legacy, flat kinds of database tables, that sort of thing, but they're out there. And in that case, that's where this would come in very handy to only return maybe, let's say, 5 or 10 fields that you really need out of there. Okay. Again, all things considered, you would want to make sure that if you were working with, in this case, the categories table, that it's going to return records that include all the required fields if you're adding records or updating records and that sort of thing. So it looks pretty complex. It's actually not that complex, but it's definitely something that you want to be aware of, right? So that's you know, that's that. So it's great. It's actually a good little thing. You can do a lot of interesting stuff with using the selected columns and you know, the column list array objects. So that's pretty cool when you get time. Okay, where clause object. So that's very powerful. When we want to filter a data source, this is where in code, this is where we'll use the where clause object. So I use that all the time. Fundamentally, let's say I want to filter a list of, you know, a show orders table page. I want to filter it by user ID. I could again use the formula wizard to do that, which is very easy and certainly a lot faster than writing your code. But fundamentally, if you go in and look at section 2 and you look for how IronSpeed is using, let's say, user ID to filter the show table page, then you find that it's pretty much exactly the same way. I often use the where clause object depending if I've got a page where I need to filter on maybe a session variable, then that's where I use a custom where clause object. I use that when I'm creating ASCX pages, which obviously operate. They're their own special object, which is essentially a page, but you can have it display on another page, and so you don't specifically pass in parameters to an ASCX page, but what you could do is modify the where clause for the data source in that ASCX to use it to filter by a session variable, which you would have set before you call that page. So then that's how that would work. So anyway, it's just a little off topic with that, but that's how the where clause object works. And you can see here where we're declaring a variable called WC of type where clause. That's strongly typed again, and we want to create a new object based upon the where clause class or where clause template. Okay, and in here you're saying wc.iand, so we're using an and where customers table.country equals to USA, and also where the state equals to California. So in this case, we're filtering not only by the country, but also by a specific state. And okay, so here's another one where you could say I want to create a new where clause WC2, and I want it to return. This is a bit of a dumb example, really, because you would never say contact name equals Jones or contact name equals Jones. You would say maybe contact name equals Jackson. So there'd be something different there. So I've got to get these pages cleaned up. But otherwise, that the syntax is correct and it does work. And then when that's done, then you add on the where clause to the original clause. So in other words, what's interesting here is you could say I want to return all records, first of all, where they're from USA, the country, United States, and the state of California, and then also I want to within that produce anybody named Jones. And so you can see how you can actually have one where clause added to another, and that's how you would then go in and specifically use ands and ors to return values. That's probably not entirely the way I would do it, but that's certainly a very valid construct to consider. And so there's a lot of value in terms of how this works. And I can see that would work. And of course, then you go through and you then return, it returns an array of objects of type customer's record from that record call. Okay. Order by allows sorting. Very nice to be able to sort. By different ways. I'm just going to open this up here, and bear with me for a second here while I'm doing that. I'm trying. We got 4 monitors, and I think that's just not enough. It's anyway. The point being is, let me find my. Somewhere here, I've got a cloud. Oh, okay. I got the wrong application open. Okay. And so again, you can determine how you want to sort and what fields you want to sort by. You can have multiple. Levels of order by. And so maybe you want to sort it by last contacted, and from within last contacted by contact name, so that if you then obviously if you had a number of people that were last contacted, yesterday, then you'll see all the records essentially in order by last contacted. But within that last contacted for that date, you would then also, you could sort by contact names in ascending or descending, or as the case may be, right? So you can decide, you can really tailor it the way you want. And you can have multiple order bys. And of course, the nice thing about it in doing it in code is that you can have custom logic that would add in. So if situation 1 occurs, then I want to sort the data by this particular method. If it's a different way, then sort it another way. And a good example of that is an application I wrote in support of a local kids triathlon in my area. And depending on which age group they're in, we need to group the boys and girls either separately or together. And so being able to sort the data in a particular order is either important or it's not important. So if the user, through the user interface, if you decide, again, for a particular age group that you wanted to make sure that each gender was in its own swim lane, then you'd want to sort by the gender to make sure that all the boys got grouped together and all the girls got grouped together. And in in younger age groups in triathlon, that's often the way they do that, especially in the 10 and under kind of thing. So there's actually a real world example there. And depending on how our time goes here, I think we're running out of time here, but that's the kind of thing that you run into. Okay. All right. Updating data, again, the same thing. Updatable rec equals get record, comma true. As we talked about, that's the mutable thing. So that's another way you can do it here. So you can see the return a list of records, customer records, and this construct, a couple different ways you can have this construct, but that works. So you're basically processing each record as within whatever the list of records that's found. So there's nothing major there, other than in this example, there's no transaction boundary set up here. In other words, start transaction, commit transaction, end transaction. But you can see what they're doing is they're just updating, every country to be United States of America. Okay, fine. Save, done, process on to the next record. Okay, pretty straightforward. Okay, before I go back to, yes, we are almost done, so my timing is actually not too bad. Okay, Benson, he's left, so I'll skip his question for the moment. Octavio asks the question, sometimes it requires passing 2 values in from another table into the current page by a selection list. Example, take the product name and price value in the current table and recording this data to make calculations and selection. How can be the process? I think what you would probably want to do is the user would select a product name, and then I presume there's another drop-down or another selection list of some kind called price value. You would then grab those 2 values and then encode. Yeah, that was a little more complex, Octavio. It's not really part of this class. You can certainly contact me online or via email, miles@milestone.ca, if you, and I'll try and answer that question for you, if you want. Okay. Anyway, what I wanted to mention just at the very end of this class is we talked about localization. If you would like your application to have some full support for multiple languages, then the only tool in the market is Milestone Localizer. It'll actually fully localize your IronSpeed applications. It works with IronSpeed 12.1, and it'll actually localize everything: menu items, field labels, tab panel headings, column headings, page and dialog titles, tooltips, pretty much everything. And so if you're interested, please go to ironspeedmvp.com/localizer. Download it, have a boo at it, tell me what you think, and then there's a use the code ISD305, and it's good for 15% off. So only people taking this class that showed up are going to get this code, and of course no obligation, but something to consider. And that's it. There is our course. I don't know if there's any more questions. If there are, then by all means, please, I'm happy to hang around for a few minutes and to talk to you about it. So there you have it. I don't know if I'm going to wait for another minute or so and see if there's any more questions. And by all means, keep the questions coming if you have any. I'll wait for about another minute, and then I will we'll stop. I hope you've enjoyed this class. It's a very high-level, fast overview of quite a complex topic, but hopefully it'll give you, at least a glimmer of what you can do with the Iron Speed object model, which is very, very extensive. And of course, Iron Speed eats their own dog food, as the term goes. And you can obviously go into section 2 and see how Iron Speed uses pretty much all of these things, in its own case, right? So keep that in mind. And in that note, I don't see any other questions. I hope everybody's had a enjoyable and productive hour with me, and that you've learned something from it. And again, on behalf of Iron Speed Designer and the folks at Iron Speed, I'd like to thank you for attending the class today. Thanks.